Today we are talking about scripts. What? Like scripts, like scripts for handling different scenarios in your firm, be it new client onboarding, be it an upsell to another service. Listen, do you know how much experience I have? Do you know what a wizard I am? Here's the thing, just like processes, just like how you make the sausage, how you handle that client conversation, that can be systematized as well. And if you want to scale your magnificence using scripts to like dial in the way that we handle certain conversations with clients makes it way easier for the rest of your team. I would argue also makes it easier for you because as perfect as you are, most of us haven't put a whole lot of thought into like what are the things that we make sure we say every single time we are onboarding a new client or going through a renewal. And scripts are how we ensure that we tick all those boxes. Doesn't mean that you're following it word for word, but it's a framework for you to work within that then makes it much easier to pull other people into that process. And today we are going to build one such example, and I think you're going to absolutely love it. Come on in with me, Jason, on Firms. All right, this is one of those things where if you don't build a system for it, you end up being overly reliant on expertise. Expertise is the brute force way of getting this thing done. And when it comes to scripts and the ways that we interact with clients, probably just having somebody that's overflowing with Riz is like the brute force alternative here, like where they can kind of muddle through any conversation and do that effortlessly. Like that's not most accountants. And so if we can give them a script to help them through that process, make sure that they're covering everything that we need them to cover, then it's more likely they come out on the other side with what we need. Somebody got mad that I said Riz the other day. They're like, immediate credibility loss because you just said the word Riz. Instant ban, okay? If only there was a way to do that on a podcast. Okay, several contexts for where you could build a script. And your two biggest blockers with scripts are going to be, you can't script the unscriptable, Jason. Certain things are just pure craft. My essence cannot be documented. Buddy, everything can be systematized. I mentioned last week, I'm going through the Checklist Manifesto book. It is so good. I highly recommend you read or listen to it if you haven't. It's basically just pushing back on every notion that you have about things being like impossible to systematize. It just kind of breaks through all that, and it's really, really helpful. But meetings, they absolutely can be scripted. Virtually every sales process out there is working off of a script. And I know there's a lot of bad versions of that where like, well, that's all the proof I need that I'm not gonna script my calls. But pushing back on the notion that these things can't be scripted, I think is valuable for the same reason that trying to standardize more of your work, even though that's hard, and even though 100% of it can't be standardized, like trying to do 20% and then 40% and then 60%, that is a worthwhile exercise worth going through. Scripts, totally the same thing. That's going to be your first blocker. Your second blocker is going to be, I don't actually even know how to write this or what it should be, which was definitely my blocker preparing for this episode. And if you have the same thought, it ought to bring you full circle to be like, well, maybe we should actually hit the brakes and have a more meaningful conversation of what those conversations should be. That first discovery call with a client, what should you actually be talking about? When you have a renewal call, when you're talking about upselling somebody to a new service, what are the things that you need to cover every single time you have that call? And are you actually going through that conversation in an optimized way? Because sales and like getting someone to a desired outcome is very much a science that a tremendous amount of thought and investment has gone into. And most accountants have not even like scratched the surface of the right and wrong ways to do that. And part of having a script is to have something concrete that's agreed upon, that's not perfect, but the best that we've been able to figure out so far. And that's like, for me, that was the other big blocker was I'm going to put something on paper and it's probably going to be really embarrassing and really bad, but that's the value of the script. Like a system, it can be improved upon rather than just freewheeling into every little conversation you have. So a few contexts where you could build scripts. Explaining a set of financial statements. You mean you can't standardize that? I actually did this with AI maybe 9 months ago on my newsletter. I basically took the same SOP that I used with my team when we mandated using video deliveries. Every month when we sent a set of financials to the client, the team had to include a 3-minute video explainer of the financials. The clients absolutely ate it up, but my team, who hadn't done a ton of delivery like this before, was a little unclear on, well, what do I talk about in the financials and what's the client going to care about? And I did what I think we all need to try to do. And I did my best to like codify my expertise and the way that I did it, because they all looked at me and they're like, you're so good at this, I'm not gonna be able to do it like you. And I said, I know you won't, because I'm the best, but let me give you the version that's like 80% of the way there. And so I built an SOP that was like, you always, when you go through the balance sheet, you always talk about the cash accounts. You always talk about current ratio. You're going through the P&L, you always talk about payroll expenses. You always talk about things that change, more than 50% beyond that month over month. Like, what is your process, kind of the mental things that you know that you always go through and do? I codified that. And from that, the team was able to like quickly deliver a set of financials with more or less the same insights that I would have offered. Another context where scripts can help, tax return delivery, a little more open-ended than financial statements. But even within that, there are some constraints like, the tax return summary. Like even if you just had a script for how you talk through a tax return summary, that would be valuable for your team. Another scenario, a specific like upsell situation where you're trying to get a client from service A to service B, and like a tax planning meeting. Like maybe the initial meeting before you do the work, or maybe the delivery meeting. So I thought, how do we make this hyper practical? Let's go through and do this live, and it'll be really bad, but so will yours, Kay. Don't you point that finger at me, you got 4 pointing at yourself. So the example I wanna go through is a super common upsell that I did in my firm, getting people from bill pay to cash advisory. So cash advisory was a service that we figured out how to more or less automate, but people would pay really, really well for it. And it was actually worth it for us to get into bill pay, which we couldn't really make money on, because a huge percentage of those people, ultimately, we were able to upsell into cash advisory, which we could make a bunch of money on. So what are the things that this script needs to have? Well, for one, it ought to have a clear goal of what we're looking to do, which isn't necessarily to convince them of anything. Rather, it's to get them to a decision of whether it feels worthwhile or not for them today. And if not, understand why. And we can use that to kind of refine how we communicate our service. But then if we get through that conversation and even we are like, yeah, no, you really don't need this, that's probably good data as well that we can use to inform like, who do we try to upsell this service to in the future? This script also ought to sort of chunk out the stages of the conversation, the general arc that you want the conversation to follow. Each ought to build upon the previous, because the next, like nailing the next section, doesn't become possible until you've laid that groundwork, until you've kind of ticked the boxes of the previous sections. The script should give you a whole bunch of good open-ended questions for each stage of this. I don't know about you, I had a couple like banker questions that I always came back to, and I'd heard so many different answers to it. It was like this safe place where I could start a conversation there with a client, and I more or less knew sort of the branching logic as it would flow from there. But oftentimes the hardest thing is just having the right question, the right open-ended question to ask, and so that's a good thing that we can build into the scripts. You can include handling for really common scenarios in each stage, and you can add to this over time. So you ask open-ended question, they respond with a really common pain point, develop that script a little further down that path if you feel like you have like a real intelligent or helpful way to respond to that. It's worth building in stages that kind of hit pause and repeat back to the client sort of where you've gotten so far to, confirm that everybody's on the same page. It's also like a really big psychological thing to pair it back to someone, something that they will say yes to. Like the act of saying yes builds momentum in a conversation like this. And then last, define like what exactly is the off-ramp from this conversation? What are the action items? If they opt in, when should that client expect to hear from us next? Like what's everything that happens after that if they opt in or opt out? Because even if they opt out, there's information there that we want to capture so that we're not trying to cram it down this person's throat down the road, and maybe even to better inform how we communicate what the service is for future people that we have the same conversation with. You know what? Let's put those 6 bullet points that I just said into the show notes. Like if you're looking for a starting point, then you could swipe those, and maybe that's a helpful way to kind of start structuring that. Today's episode is sponsored in part by LiveFlow. They just shipped LiveFlow dashboards. And if you're looking for a little way to gussy up the monthly reporting that you do for your clients, this is pretty nice. They're like modular. You can put your own commentary in. Not a like giant reporting suite, not something the client has to go log into. In fact, if you're looking for like how to wade into more valuable advisory conversations with clients, oftentimes You can only get there if you're giving them information that they can understand. And sending them a couple of PDFs of financial statements, that is not likely to lead to advisory conversations because they don't know how to make that stuff actionable. The more that they can understand what you're sending them, the more likely it will lead to valuable conversations. LifeFlow's got a bunch of templates you can swipe to get started, like even a P&L dashboard that's pretty cool, a daily cash movement report. A lot of stuff that if your client saw it, they'd be like, oh, I would like to have that. And from there, you then go from just churning out financials to being irreplaceable, their buddy. And these days, we all need another friend. We all need more buddies, right? I think so. Everybody else? Everyone in the room's nodding their head in agreement. Learn more about LifeFlow, check out the link down in the show notes. This episode is sponsored in part by Client Hub, who I recently named one of my top practice management system recommendations heading into 2025. But according to Client Hub, when it comes to picking a PM, it comes down to the 4 C's: capabilities, client experience, clarity, and community. Today we're talking client experience. The biggest blocker to getting stuff out the door with clients is waiting on them not following through on what I need, which is what makes Client Hub a really unique client experience. It's basically like a 2-sided task management system. You're doing your work over here, client's doing their work over there. It actually looks largely the same, the 2 sides of that system. This isn't like a portal that they bolted onto a task management system after the fact, which is what most PMs are. Client Hub was built for the client experience from the ground up, since that's what's going to make you more productive, a better client experience. If you've been unhappy with that side of the systems that you use today, Client Hub might be a great fit for you. Learn more about that one, check out the link down in the show notes. So I'll talk you through this high-level script that I made, and as I've said several times now, as I read back through it, it really isn't good. But I also don't know that it's any worse than what that conversation would have looked like if I actually just picked up the phone and had it with a client, which I've had this conversation a bunch of times. But for some reason, when I see it written down, I'm like, oh, this sucks. This doesn't do this well enough, or that. It's not optimized in this way or that way. And the reality is, until we go through this exercise, we're probably having these conversations in very non-optimized ways. So here's my script. First bullet point, you got 15 minutes for a check-in. Wanted to see how things are going and had a couple thoughts on opportunities of what we could do better. So I'm framing this as an opportunity for them. I don't want to frame it as something that they're doing wrong that we can fix, because that requires them to agree or accept the fact that they're doing something wrong. Don't even try to fight that battle. I'm framing this as an opportunity. I'll hit on something along the lines of, each year around this time, I do some strategic planning around what we do for you, make sure it's still necessary, and seeing if there's any opportunities that we're missing out on. Then I'll get into something along the lines of, how is, cash visibility related thing? Or I know we've talked about this cash related thing. How do you feel on that right now? Or it looks like some insight that I've gleaned from their work. Cash has been better, cash has been tighter. What do you attribute that to? So kind of kicking off an open-ended conversation of where they feel like they're at with their cash situation, what they see the drivers being, so that we can get a better understanding of where they're at, and just to kind of warm them up to that conversation. I got a bullet point in here that is find a way to relate to ultimately what that response is, either from my own entrepreneurial journey or from something more personally that they have shared. What impact does that have kind of on your work-life balance, or something that makes that feel a little bit more personal to them, to get out of sort of the business thing for a moment. The next section here, I've got framed as kind of a transition to get them to start confirming some of my suspicions and agree that they need some sort of solution. So in this transition, I'm asking things like, does this stress you out? Does this keep you busy? In here, I kind of try to clarify what the goal ought to be. Does it keep you from other things that would drive the health of the business overall? That's probably the biggest opportunity here, is not this specific acute pain or thing. This is blocking you from whatever is next, from whatever is better, and only you are going to drive that forward. That's a much better framing of the value of what you're going to do for them. Another way to say the same thing, what could you work on instead? I've got 2 more sections. Next is create curiosity. So I've kind of confirmed where they're at right now. So because of ABC, you can't do XYZ, they're blocked by this. Makes total sense. And here I'm probably going to tease something that we've done with a number of our other clients that in most cases has gone pretty well. They shared XYZ similar blockers. Happy to share this process with you. Do you have anybody on your team that could help you to do this? And the answer there is almost always no, or they would just sooner have you do it. And then from there, I'm either going to get them on an engagement right away, Or I'm going to say, like, if I'm fairly certain that they need this, maybe in a way that they don't even realize yet, I may say, like, how about this? We'll start doing this for you today until the end of the week, and you can tell me if it's worthwhile or not. We could talk price a bit here. I would usually frame that as, in other situations, this usually came in for a situation like yours around X per week. But even there, I'm happy to like this is an ongoing client where we do a bunch of stuff for them already. Even there, I'm going to be happy with a very limited scope to say but give us a few days to do this for you. Let's see if it does what we think that it will do, and then we can go from there. And oftentimes what happens is they love it. It helps unblock some other things, and they're like, don't stop doing this. Send the proposal through and they accept it right away. Again, not a super locked down script, but even this is better than nothing because it's giving me some prompts. If I get stuck, it's helping me to guide the overall flow of the conversation, not get too down to brass tacks too fast, which oftentimes I had a problem with. I just get hyper rational and hyper technical, and that's not how most people make buying decisions. In fact, it oftentimes gets them to be super, super rational back to me. And then we start splitting hairs over the cost of this or that. And it's no, the opportunity is you, what you can do otherwise, the other ways that you could spend your time, how you doing this thing isn't going to take you on a path that you ultimately want to go down. So even some structure like this, I think, can be helpful. But rather than just sitting here and talking about it, let's get somebody on the phone. Let's actually do it. We'll do it live. Hey, Gerald.
Well, howdy there. This here's Gerald speaking. Now, who's this, and what sort of business y'all reckon you've got with old Gerald?
This doesn't sound like Gerald.
Mind you, I got my hands fuller than a tick on a hound dog with this here retail flooring enterprise. So let's make sure it's worth my time, alrighty?
I'll get right down to the point. You got 15 minutes for a check-in. I wanted to see how things were going and had a couple thoughts on opportunities of what we could do better for you.
Well, all right then. But let's keep her tighter than a bark on a tree, you hear?
Okay.
I ain't one for all this modern hullabaloo, but I'll bite. Things seem to be humming along well enough, so I reckon if it ain't broke, I don't need no fixin'. What you gotta say about that?
Okay. So he already isn't open to my suggestions. So each year we do some strategic planning around what we do for you, both to make sure it's necessary, like you said, but also to see if there's any opportunities that we're missing. I know we've talked about cash management a few times and how that's gotten tight. It feels like the last few weeks, bill pay's been a little tighter. Any insights on why that is or what's holding up cash?
Well, money's like butter on a hot biscuit. It spreads thin real quick round here.
Yep.
Costs been crawling up faster than a squirrel up a tree. Nothing to fret too hard over, though. I've managed this long without fussing over strategic plans, so I reckon I'm just fine as is.
You ever get about 20 seconds into a bit and regret it? So getting real tactical, what do you think is causing that? You mentioned costs and money being spread thin, but do you have any idea exactly what the inputs are that are making cash be more constrained?
Well, reckon it's a heap of things stacking up like firewood. Supplies ain't cheap, freight's going up, and labor costs, well, they ain't what they used to be neither. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry wants more, and customers seem slower than a Sunday driver paying up these days. So yeah, guess that cash flow's trickling in about as slow as molasses in January. Don't mean I need no overhaul, though. Just part of the business.
That creating any stress for you?
Ain't no picnic, I'll say that much.
You gotten out on the boat much this year?
Not near as much as I'd like. Business keeps nipping at my heels.
A lot of these things, customer payments, costs, this is stuff that we can project pretty accurately. If we had if we had our fingers on the pulse of this a little better, would it give you some flexibility to, I don't know, have a little more attention that you could give to more long-term business stuff, profitability, pricing strategy, not getting mired into that day-to-day sort of cash grind?
Well, now, you might be onto something there. If I didn't have to wrestle that cash flow bear every day, reckon I could steer the ship a little steadier. Maybe get some time to think long-term instead of just keeping the wolves from the door.
Is that tight cash stopping you from becoming more profitable and having the time to focus on that better work?
Might be. Hard to grow when you're just scraping by. Feels like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it.
So I was actually just talking with somebody else that we rolled out just kind of a cash planning solution for a couple months ago that has worked pretty well. Basically, a couple times a week, we send you a short report of what the next 3 or 4 weeks look like. You know much further ahead of time if you got to, put together a plan to make payroll or if you got to push some bills off. You got to go dialing for dollars to get some client payments in. You can see that stuff much further into the future. And actually, in the case with this other client is once we had that, we were actually able to step in and help with more of that on your behalf. so that we could better advise on, you probably don't want to pay this bill yet. Probably need to hound this client for payment. Probably need to set up better payment terms with these couple of customers. It's actually worked surprisingly well if you wanted to explore something like that. Not perfect, but that's why we're building a script, right?
Well, I'll be. Now, that kind of heads up sounds right helpful. Ain't no harm in seeing down the road a piece if it'll keep me from scrambling like a headless chicken. If y'all could help wrangle those late payers and point me toward what bills to hold off on, that might just keep my hair from turning any grayer. Reckon it couldn't hurt to give it a whirl, long as it don't mean messing with what's already working.
How about this? We're not going to put another thing on you, another thing on the team. Let's do this for the rest of the week. We can circle back early next week and see if it was helpful for you and go from there.
Well, shoot. That sounds downright manageable.
Well, shoot.
If y'all can handle the heavy lifting and I just gotta sit back and take a look-see, then all right, I'll give it a fair shake. Let's give her a go and see if it's worth its salt next week.
This is really weird and clunky, but this sort of exercise with your team, I think, is actually pretty helpful and like kind of fun if it's not too high pressure. I think with every version of that you do, you're also going to improve upon your script. You're going to be like, yeah, I didn't really cover this bit, or it went off track a bit over there, or here's a few more examples that maybe would have been better. But having no script, which is, I think, the case for most of us and most of the calls that we go into, even though a big percentage of them are recurring calls or recurring formats of calls, having no script, you kind of just go wherever the conversation takes you rather than like having to get it from A to B, or there being an optimal outcome for a meeting where you can iterate on that script and build that out over time and then systematize that and pull other people into that process. Again, it is the difference between building an SOP for how to do a thing and then asking someone to follow it versus just like projecting your wisdom onto them and hoping that they get there someday. Like, one of those paths is much shorter than the other, and they're not going to be as good as you maybe, and that's totally fine. But giving them your process is actually going to accelerate their path towards not only getting better at that, but running those meetings in greater alignment with your expectation, with what you want to see. I'm actually curious, anybody has like scripts out there that they've used that they love or that they swear by? Would love to hear more if you're open to sharing that stuff in the comments. Not the scripts themselves, but just kind of best practices for how to build that stuff out. And that's all we got for today. Thanks for coming and hanging.